We have from Google, the Chief Measurement Strategist, Neil Hoyne, and from InfoTrust, our very own Chief Growth Officer, Michael Loban. Michael, I'll let you take it away.
Brad, thank you so much. Excited to be here, and welcome everyone. Neil, it's great to have you.
Hey, thank you for having me, Michael. How are you doing?
Doing very well. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. We tend to have these conversations on a regular basis. Now we just have a few hundred people joining us.
We have a few hundred people join. Well, welcome a few hundred people to my home. We're still doing the work from home, both Michael, you and I. Actually, I was joking. This I offer almost apologetically when they did the title slide where they had our headshots side by side. Just given these unique times, obviously working from home, I have two little ones that run around. They almost barge into my office enough to where they warrant their own headshots. So I offer almost that apologetically, but I think it ties almost to the comment Amin and Pat made earlier, just about kind of the flexibility we've been seeing in the workplace, what we've been seeing in industries. We can talk about that. We can talk about that. Those are just some of my statements. Yeah, where would you like to jump in, Michael?
Well, like you said, let's talk about what is going on in the industry. What are some of the things that you are seeing that we should be paying attention to? And obviously, some of the topics we'll dive in a greater detail as the day goes by, but maybe we can share with our audience a lay of the land and what is happening in the industry right now.
Boy, I'll give you some high-level comments. Let's just start with what we're seeing, and I'll say that as it's been since March, it continues to evolve. But here's kind of what stands out for me. So we've talked a lot about retail disruption and innovation and people moving from online or moving from offline to online. I'm going to tuck those away because I think they're a little bit obvious for now. What I find fascinating are really a few things. One is just when this happened, the disruption that a lot of companies saw to their data. And so in the past, if we look at really over the past decade that I've had the pleasure of working at Google, every year was more iterative than the year before. It was to say, we want to move more into this channel, or we want to invest more into this product or this audience. And I don't know a lot of companies that have revisited the strategy they had set out in January 2020 once we got to April of last year. And a lot of companies, I was actually surprised, almost threw away their data sets because those numbers were so remarkably different. The quarter over quarter comparisons didn't make a lot of sense. The annual plans didn't make a lot of sense. And so what's been fascinating is just to see how different retailers are adapting to the circumstances. And I would put those broadly in two buckets. I would say one is just the assumptions that companies made. Some companies made the assumption to say, and this was really how they were operating, they said, we expect this to be over in 2 months. So our approach is to hold on. Others say, we expect this digital transformation that we've seen happening to only accelerate, and that's going to be the new way that we want to plan. Some looked at customers and said, you know what, these customers are just coming to us now because circumstances have changed. But they're not going to be with us whenever this pandemic resolves. So we don't want to spend a lot of time acquiring and developing those relationships, where we saw other retailers on the opposite side saying, this is our shot to win over customers who wouldn't have tried us, but now we have the inventory, the shipping, the availability to bring them the products they want. We have a better experience. They haven't considered us before. Now I won't go into the merits of each of these decisions. Some companies will feel very strongly about one versus the other. What I find fascinating is that a lot of companies haven't revisited those assumptions since April or May. So they set them out and they said, this is how we think our customers are going to behave. This is how we think our business is going to behave. And they've almost taken that data to fit that story without now taking a step back to say, well, what assumptions did we make? And are they different? Have they changed? And I think the larger implication, at least for the audience, not only understanding the assumptions, what is driving your business, what has changed, but also how that's framing the progress that businesses are making. So classically, we'd see people saying, well, we want to make this transformation. For some companies, they had 5-year plans for how they wanted to move from offline to online sales. That was their approach, at least. And they're looking and they've made that progress in 3 months. Their audience has shifted. And for that, they're saying, well, this is fantastic. We were able to move not just 15% or 20% of our sales, but 40%, 50% of our sales online. But again, they never went back to those assumptions to say, should we be doing more? because they've hit their historical metrics. So I'd say it's really just understanding what this new landscape looks like, where the opportunities are, what assumptions were made, and what really are we looking at as a benchmark for success.
So how would you advise organizations do it in terms of revisiting their assumptions based on the data that has been collected so far? So some organizations possibly put their foot on the gas and they've seen outstanding results. Some organizations have seen good results and now feel very comfortable, maybe confident. How do we take into account what has happened to determine, should we keep going all in? Do we wait a little bit more? How should we start thinking about the next 6 to 9 months?
You know, I think that the next 6 to 9 months, as markets continue to reopen, as vaccines continue to roll out, I think that's going to be an even more interesting time than what we've seen in the past year. But when we talk about it, I think the first thing with a lot of companies is simply to understand the assumptions by which your data is based. Let's take something like lifetime value, which I saw on the agenda for later today. Some companies early on said, you know what, we don't think these customers are going to stay with us. So if we think this situation will last for a year, we're going to cut off lifetime value after a year. We think those customers are gone, which means that they changed how they bid, how they invest, how much they want to spend on service, with just that view that this is very short term, that they don't want to make those investments. And so once companies start categorizing to say, when we look at our models and our metrics, the data that's guiding our business today, how did we derive those numbers? That's the exercise that we see a lot of smart companies going through, is almost revisiting that plan and saying, and here's the second part to the puzzle, is no one's arguing that they know the answer. Nobody had a playbook sitting on the shelves that they pulled off and said, in the event of a global pandemic, these are the 6 steps. Everybody's working their way through it. But the 2 things we see smart companies doing, one is they're building different scenarios where they're simply saying, look, let's plan for the worst case, but let's also acknowledge the best case. What would we do differently if this is how online transactions continue? What are we going to do differently if this is the way that customers behave, if our retention metrics are off? And that way they're starting to line up the planning and the investments in those areas. The other part that they're starting to look at is just to say, well, what is the opportunity for us to test? If we don't know how consumers are responding. So right now, one of the concerns across the industry is we want to get in front of markets that open up. We want to know that, well, when people get vaccinated or when their travel plans change or their vacation plans change, we want them to think of us. But we don't want to be opportunistic. And so there's half of the companies that are saying we're going to deliberate around a boardroom table and figure out what should be best. And there's another portion of companies that are saying we're going to build rapid iteration, rapid testing more into our marketing and data model than it's ever been before, because we don't know how consumers will respond. The worst case is just everybody following everybody else. We saw this in April where people went out and you got all the same emails from everyone. It was like, we're all in this together, buy our product. And because that was what was safe. Now what we see is companies are just saying, we acknowledge what we don't know. We acknowledge what we're assuming. And what we don't know, we're going to make those investments to test and to learn, because that's the only way we're going to figure out how consumers are going to respond to our marketing activities.
I love that you mentioned the modeling. I think it's such an important aspect of analytics. So any type of business planning is building a model based on possible scenarios that we might have. And this very much resonates with me after all the holiday, Black Friday, Christmas sales, when there's so many different discounts that are being thrown at you. And when we meet with many organizations, we ask, so what do you expect this to produce? And usually organizations have maybe one number that they want to hit, but it's not necessarily modeled. Here's our best case scenario. Here's our worst case scenario. This is kind of gray area where it would be great for us to land out. And depending on where they actually end up or how they are progressing, adjust those models.
That's the idea. But you do bring that up, which is worth pushing on, is that what some companies have said, it's said, look, marketing is difficult, right? We don't know how to reach consumers. In some cases, they're not using our products. They're not buying new luggage because they're not taking that trip for example. And so they're wondering, and they're saying, well, where do we invest? Where do we invest in a way, this common theme around resiliency and durability? Before it was all about efficiency, right? You didn't want to hold excess inventory. You didn't want to spend a penny more than you needed to. And now companies are saying, well, where should we make these investments in solutions and ideas that we know are going to persist? And you raised an interesting one, which is we do see a lot of companies saying, if we can't trust our historical reports and our historical trends, if we're seeing data disappear, we have this weird changing privacy landscape around us where we're losing data between app to web and third-party cookies, reporting becomes less and less compelling because there's holes and there's gaps. Even quarter-over-quarter comps don't work. And so the first investment we see them making is saying, hey, let's make these investments to say, if we know reporting isn't going to work, if we know the future is uncertain, can we improve our modeling capabilities? And that's where we're seeing huge investments from companies into machine learning to fill that gap, to give those scenarios, to predict how customers will behave, when customers will leave as new data is captured. And the fascinating point with that as well is that you don't need 100% of your data to do it. So that allows companies to focus to say, we need to understand if we understand 5% or 6% of our audience really well, we can make better assumptions as to what's happening with 100% in advance than simply looking back and saying, well, where do we think historical patterns are going to play out? That logic no longer holds. So that machine learning, that model building, that is taking a huge piece of their priorities. That we know will persist long-term regardless of how markets play out. And the other part that we see is finally we see more emphasis on data integration. In order to make this modeling happen, first-party data not only needs to be cleaned and organized, it needs to be centralized. And it needs to be tied to some type of identifier. And companies are looking and saying, when we look across those, that data integration layer, that machine learning layer, those are two that if we look into the future, 12 to 18 months, we don't necessarily know how markets or consumer behavior are going to be. But we see those two areas, those two investments of technology as persisting and being incredibly valuable for the companies that got in front of it.
I love that point. And we actually have a presentation coming up from Alessandra from Ecentria, who will talk about data integration. Neil, one thing that you've mentioned that certainly very much resonates with me is around the machine learning and ability to make decisions as the data comes in, not waiting until that end of the month, right, until end of the quarter, which often how historically organizations have done it. And that means that organizations need to start building the right type of team, right? It's not just about those machine learning tools that are available, but it's having the right type of skill set and people. How should organizations be thinking of who to possibly bring to their team, what capabilities or what skill set they need to either develop in-house and train team members or possibly go and hire?
You know, it's interesting when we talk about machine learning, Michael, and generally companies look at it purely from a technical side. If we're going to do more machine learning and modeling, we need to hire machine learning people. And those people are expensive, and that limits progress. The paradigm has been shifting a little bit across cloud platforms where, again, this is not a Google endorsement. This is just to give you the reality of it, sure. where tools are starting to reflect those difficulties within organizations. So traditionally, when we looked at machine learning on its own, you really required three things. You required lots of data, lots of computing power, and machine learning experts to make everything work. But the machine learning experts are difficult to have in that equation. It's probably the most daunting part for companies as they start to get ramped up in this area. So what I see is an emerging class of products that are really making these types of machine learning models automated. So an oversimplification here, but I know you always appreciate these, is that when I look at it, I see, all right, well, the machine learning expert, their value is to be able to look at a model and say, look, there's hundreds of different levers. Which levers do I pull on to get the best result out of the model? Because knowing which lever to pull on can save you millions of dollars when you go to optimize and use your budgets. And what we've seen, what we've seen companies like Google Cloud do is they say, hey, instead of having machine learning expert to pull those levers, what if we just ran every possible permutation and combination of those levers and just told you what to do? And so you're almost brute forcing machine learning, which is fantastic because now what it does is it removes that third component to say, when you have cloud, you have all this computing power, you've integrated all your data. So now you have data and computing power, and we're just going to run 60, 70,000 different attempts at these models and tell you what's best. And again, I'm overly simplifying it, but what it's really doing is it's allowing analysts to build machine learning models. If only there's a leadership in the organization to know that these capabilities are there and to help train and onboard them to say you have access to the data and now we can enable these types of capabilities. When we take a step back and we look at the larger organization, you're going to need three types of people. You're going to need the people that are building the big data systems, the ones that are capturing, collecting data, APIs, and building pipes across your organization and third parties to bring that data together. You're going to need the analysts, the people that really churn through that data to build those reports and hopefully those antique dashboards, but now transitioning into those machine learning models. But you also need a third part. You need a third role that's going to help you build credibility in the organization. So too oftentimes we go to boards or we go to executives and say, look, we can now predict the future, and these customers, we use lifetime value, are going to spend this amount in the future. And you see especially the CFO will always be like, wait a minute, so now you built a model, so I'm supposed to trust that the investment you made today will pay off in the future. No, we're not doing that, but thank you. And the problem is that analysts and machine learning experts, by and large, myself included, can have a difficult time speaking that language, telling them and walking them through the process to say why this matters to the business, why it is an imperative, why we should trust this, and how we transition into that process. So on the data science team, not only do you have the people building the data sets and building the models, but you also need someone that's going to be able to integrate those findings and those metrics to other teams. Not only to be able to share and to say, this is how they were derived, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is how companies apply it, to help them along in that journey, to be comfortable in this transition, this from reporting data to predicting behaviors, but then also to take their feedback and what their objections are and what their comfort levels are and bring that back to the data scientists, to the modelers, to say, where can we make and integrate these compromises so they work with the larger business? I'm sure even in the simple case, I know you and I have all seen these dashboards where we look at it and you'll look at Google Analytics and it'll be like, sales are up in Brazil by 1,200%. And that's fantastic. And it looks great in a dashboard because you have this big green number on the top and you have the year-over-year increase. And then you get someone from supply chain being like, what am I supposed to do with this? Or your CFO being like, okay, so should we go big in Brazil? And people that build reports don't think about those questions. They report what the data shows. So we're seeing more and more companies invest both in training and hiring to get these people that can integrate and use that data. And here's the business case for everyone out there on the live stream. Generally, and this is the guiding number, it's remained unchanged over the past several years. Most companies will use their data in 6% of their decisions. 6%. Most of them still half are intuition, 10% whatever your boss says, whatever your colleagues say. But if you're able to improve that number, the contribution to revenue is about $55,000 incremental revenue per employee per year. And that's not going from 6% to 100%. That's going from 6% to 7%. 1 out of every 100 decisions being made using data. So that is the motivation. That's the guiding principle. That third role, people that can integrate and use that data, is so powerful in helping companies really make this transition.
Well, there's certainly a huge upside, as you mentioned, for organizations to use data in more of those decisions. One last question, because we're right about time. I'm fortunate to see you speak at this event and many other events and live in person. And you're probably the best I've seen as far as being true a storyteller, right? Using analytics and data almost as prompts to convey the message. If you had to share your maybe one recipe of success, what do you think through to really help you get the message across?
Oh boy, that's a good one. You know what I encourage people, the people that I mentor at Google, to do is just to really, and this is going to sound almost trivial, but immerse yourself in the functions that are going to be using the data that you create. Even if you don't think they should have a say, spending time with people on the finance side to understand how they make decisions, how they talk about it, not simply presenting to them or having lunch. One of the things that we do at Google, that I do with my teams, which I find beneficial, is I tell them not to sit at their desks. Say, stay at your desk 1 or 2 days a week. I know where to find you. But spend time sitting around the engineers, the product managers, the marketing teams that we have at Google. Learn how they communicate, how they build and tell their stories. We all speak generally the same language, but when you start getting into departments and teams, you see that the way that they look at problems and the way that they try to solve these problems are different than what we may anticipate just by sitting in our own bubbles trying to build great machine learning models. So my advice is, the more exposure you have, the more you can relate and build that language, the better you are. Again, these skills are not commoditized. They are incredibly rare to see people that understand the modeling side and the data integration side and the finance side. The more that you can do that, the more you'll be able to build those bridges, the more you'll be able to use data, and perhaps most importantly, the more you can help transition your company through this time based on what you're seeing from where you sit.
Thank you, Neil. I love those insights. And one of the things that I've gotten accustomed to do is whenever I'm about to present a report or a dashboard or showcase some numbers, I ask myself way ahead of time, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 questions that I most likely will get from people that have not seen this before? And I prepare myself to respond to those, which helps me build the story and really understand what is that I'm actually showing. So it's not just the data by itself, there is context around it.
I love that, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Back to you, Pat.
Thanks for having me.